My parents said I should give more since I'm single, then raised my rent to support my brother's kids. So I made a move that left them desperate and speechless. I'm 27 and I've been living in my parents' converted garage apartment for the past 3 years while saving money and building my career as a software developer. What started as a temporary arrangement to help me get established financially has become a long-term living situation that works well for everyone involved. I pay reasonable rent, help with household maintenance, and enjoy being close to family while maintaining my independence. My older brother Austin is 30 and has always been the family favorite despite making questionable life choices that constantly require financial bailouts from our parents. He dropped out of college twice, married his girlfriend after dating for only 6 months, and now has 3 young children under the age of 5. Austin works sporadically in construction and retail jobs that barely cover his basic expenses, let alone support a family of 5. The family dynamic has always revolved around Austin's needs and crises, while my stability and success were taken for granted. When Austin needed money for rent or utilities, our parents would immediately open their wallets. When I achieved professional milestones or received promotions, the response was polite acknowledgement followed by discussions about how I could help support Austin's growing family. About 18 months ago, my parents started making comments about how fortunate I was to be single and free from the financial responsibilities that came with having a family. They'd point out that I only had to worry about supporting myself while Austin was struggling to provide for his wife and 3 children. The implication was always that my financial advantages came with moral obligations to help family members who were less fortunate. These comments became more frequent and pointed after I received a significant promotion at work that came with a substantial salary increase. Instead of celebrating my professional achievement, my parents seemed to view it primarily as an opportunity for increased family support. They started making suggestions about how I could contribute more to family expenses and help Austin with his mounting financial problems. I initially tried to be supportive by helping Austin with occasional emergency expenses and buying gifts for his children during holidays and birthdays. But my contributions were never enough, and the requests for help became increasingly frequent and substantial. Austin and my parents seemed to view my income as a family resource rather than my personal earnings from years of education and hard work. The situation became more complicated when Austin's wife decided to stay home with their children rather than returning to work after their 3rd child was born. This decision effectively eliminated half of their household income while increasing their expenses significantly. Austin's sporadic employment couldn't possibly cover the costs of supporting a family of 5, and they became completely dependent on financial assistance from my parents. My parents' retirement savings began taking a serious hit as they covered Austin's rent, utilities, groceries, and childcare costs on an ongoing basis. They'd worked hard for 40 years to build financial security for their retirement, but were draining their accounts to support Austin's family. The stress of their deteriorating financial situation was affecting their health and marriage. That's when my parents approached me about what they called adjusting our arrangement to better reflect the family's current needs. They explained that Austin's family was struggling while I was doing well financially, and that everyone needed to contribute according to their abilities. They suggested that since I was benefiting from affordable housing, I should be willing to pay more to help support my nieces and nephew. The conversation felt like an ambush as my parents presented detailed calculations showing how much money they were spending on Austin's family each month. They argued that I was in the best position to help and that refusing to contribute more would be selfish given my comfortable financial situation. They framed it as a temporary arrangement until Austin could get back on his feet professionally. I pointed out that Austin had been getting back on his feet for the past 5 years with continuous financial support that never seemed to lead to actual stability or independence. I suggested that maybe constant bailouts were preventing him from developing the motivation and skills needed to support his own family. My parents dismissed these concerns, saying that children's needs couldn't wait for Austin to figure out his career. When I asked specifically how much additional rent they expected me to pay, my parents said they'd calculated that I could afford an extra $600 per month based on my recent promotion. This would bring my total housing costs to $1,300 monthly, which was still below market rate for comparable apartments, but represented a substantial increase in my expenses. The most frustrating aspect of their proposal was how they presented it as a favor to me rather than acknowledging that they were asking me to subsidize Austin's family. They emphasized how much money I was still saving compared to renting elsewhere, while minimizing the fact that I'd be paying significantly more to help support family members who made poor financial decisions. My parents gave me 2 weeks to consider their proposal for increased rent, but made it clear that this wasn't really a negotiation. They said that Austin's family needed immediate financial relief and that I was the only family member in a position to provide it. They presented the rent increase as a done deal rather than a request, emphasizing that family members had obligations to help each other during difficult times. During those 2 weeks, I watched my parents continue to enable Austin's irresponsible behavior while simultaneously pressuring me to fund their enabling. Austin would show up for family dinners empty-handed while I brought groceries and wine. He'd complain about his financial stress while wearing expensive sneakers and talking about his plans to buy a new truck. The contrast between his attitude and his supposed desperation was striking. I also noticed that my parents were treating me differently since announcing their plan to increase my rent. They seemed to view me as a financial resource rather than their son, and conversations increasingly focused on my income and expenses rather than my personal life or professional achievements. They'd make comments about my spending habits and question whether I really needed certain purchases. The breaking point came during a family barbecue when Austin made jokes about how easy my life was compared to his responsibilities as a father and husband. He said that single people didn't understand real financial pressure because they only had to worry about themselves. My parents laughed along like this was harmless teasing rather than recognizing how insulting it was to dismiss my hard work and financial discipline. That evening, my parents cornered me about finalizing the rent increase arrangement. They said they'd already committed to helping Austin with his next month's expenses and needed confirmation that I'd be contributing the additional $600. They acted like my agreement was a foregone conclusion and seemed surprised when I asked for more time to consider the decision. When I expressed concerns about the fairness of subsidizing Austin's family, while he made no effort to reduce his expenses or increase his income, my parents accused me of being selfish and unsupportive. They said that Austin's children were innocent victims who deserved help regardless of their father's mistakes. They claimed that family loyalty meant sacrificing personal interests for the greater good. I pointed out that constantly bailing out Austin prevented him from learning financial responsibility and actually harmed his children by teaching them that consequences could always be avoided through family manipulation. I suggested that maybe Austin needed to face real financial pressure to motivate him to make better decisions about work and spending. My parents rejected this perspective entirely, saying that they couldn't watch their grandchildren suffer while Austin learned life lessons. They seemed to believe that any discomfort experienced by Austin's family was my responsibility to prevent through financial contributions. They created a dynamic where Austin's poor choices became everyone else's problem to solve. The conversation became increasingly heated as my parents revealed their true expectations for my role in the family. They said that since I'd been blessed with intelligence and financial success, I had moral obligations to share those advantages with less fortunate family members. They viewed my career achievements as family assets rather than personal accomplishments. When I pointed out that Austin's financial problems were largely self-created through poor decisions about education, career, and family planning, my parents said that past mistakes didn't matter when children were involved. They claimed that Austin's kids deserved the same opportunities and security that I'd had growing up regardless of their father's irresponsibility. The ultimatum came when my parents said I had until the end of the week to agree to the rent increase, or they'd need to reconsider our living arrangement entirely. They said that if I wasn't willing to contribute more to family expenses, then maybe I should find housing elsewhere so they could rent the space to someone who would pay market rates. This threat revealed that my parents viewed our relationship as primarily transactional rather than emotional. They were willing to evict their own son to extract more money for Austin's family rather than addressing the root causes of his financial problems. They'd chosen Austin's immediate comfort over my long-term relationship with them. I realized that my parents had fundamentally misunderstood both my financial situation and my character. They seemed to think that my success had made me wealthy enough to casually absorb additional expenses while also assuming that I was emotionally dependent enough on their approval to accept exploitation rather than risk family conflict. That's when I decided to call their bluff about finding alternative housing arrangements. If they wanted to treat our relationship as a business transaction, then I'd evaluate it using business principles rather than family loyalty. They were about to learn that some gambles don't pay off and that threatening people sometimes backfires spectacularly. Instead of arguing further with my parents about the fairness of their demands, I decided to quietly explore my housing options while pretending to consider their ultimatum. I spent the week researching apartments, contacting real estate agents, and calculating the true costs of moving out. What I discovered was that my parents had seriously miscalculated their leverage in this situation. The rental market had shifted significantly since I'd moved into their garage apartment 3 years earlier. Demand for housing had increased while inventory remained limited, which meant that comparable apartments were now renting for much more than my parents had estimated. A decent one-bedroom apartment in a similar neighborhood would cost at least $1,800 per month plus utilities, parking, and various fees. But I also discovered that my increased salary put me in a position to afford these higher housing costs without significant lifestyle changes. The promotion my parents wanted to exploit had indeed improved my financial situation enough that I could comfortably live independently while maintaining my savings rate and investment contributions. Their assumption that I needed their affordable housing was no longer accurate. More importantly, I realized that my parents' threat to evict me would backfire on them financially. They'd been counting on my rent payments to help cover their mortgage and household expenses while they supported Austin's family. Losing my monthly contributions would create an immediate budget crisis that would force them to either reduce their support for Austin or dip further into their retirement savings. I also calculated what my parents would actually receive if they rented the garage apartment at market rates, as they'd threatened. Similar spaces were renting for about $1,500 monthly, which was only $200 more than they were demanding from me with the increase. But market-rate tenants would also expect professional property management, updated appliances, and regular maintenance that would reduce their net income significantly. The strategic advantage was clearly in my favor, but I decided not to reveal my research immediately. Instead, I wanted to give my parents one final opportunity to reconsider their approach and recognize the unfairness of their demands. I scheduled a family meeting for Saturday evening ostensibly to discuss the rent increase, but actually to deliver my response to their ultimatum. During the week leading up to our meeting, I noticed that my parents were already spending money they expected to receive from my increased rent payments. They'd committed to helping Austin with a security deposit for a larger apartment and had promised to cover his children's enrollment fees for daycare. They were operating under the assumption that I'd accept their terms rather than considering the possibility that I might refuse. I also observed Austin's behavior more carefully and noticed that he'd already adjusted his expectations based on the promised increase in family support. He was talking about reducing his work hours to spend more time with his children and was making plans for purchases that he couldn't afford with his current income. The entire family had reorganized their finances around money they didn't actually have yet. The night before our scheduled meeting, my parents made casual comments about their relief that we'd worked out the rent situation and their excitement about being able to help Austin's family more substantially. They seemed to have convinced themselves that my silence during the week indicated agreement rather than strategic planning. They had no idea what was actually coming. I spent Friday evening packing my most important belongings and making final arrangements for my moving schedule. I'd found a beautiful one-bedroom apartment in a newer building with amenities that my parents' garage couldn't match. The lease would begin the following Monday, which would give me a weekend to complete the transition. The irony wasn't lost on me that my parents' attempt to exploit my financial success had motivated me to finally make the move to independent living that I'd been postponing for convenience and savings. Their greed had forced me to reevaluate my living situation and realize that I was ready for the next phase of my adult life, even if it cost more money. Saturday morning, I confirmed my moving truck rental, picked up my apartment keys, and made final arrangements with utilities companies. Everything was in place for my announcement that evening. My parents thought they were about to secure an additional $600 monthly to fund Austin's lifestyle, but they were actually about to lose my entire rent contribution permanently. The family meeting took place in my parents' living room with Austin and his wife present to witness what they expected would be my agreement to subsidize their lifestyle. Everyone seemed relaxed and confident, as if the outcome had already been determined. My parents had prepared talking points about family responsibility, and Austin was already expressing gratitude for my anticipated sacrifice. I let them finish their rehearsed speeches about family obligations and the importance of supporting Austin's children before delivering the news that would shatter their assumptions. I told them that I'd spent the week carefully considering their proposal and had reached a decision about our housing arrangement. The room went quiet as everyone prepared to hear my acceptance of the increased rent. Instead, I announced that I'd found alternative housing and would be moving out by the end of the month. I explained that their ultimatum had helped me realize that I was ready for complete independence and that market-rate apartments offered amenities and space that made the higher cost worthwhile. I thanked them for helping me recognize that it was time to move forward with my life. The silence that followed was profound as my parents processed the fact that their plan had backfired completely. Instead of extracting more money from me, they were losing my entire rental contribution, plus the informal help I provided with household maintenance and expenses. Their attempt to exploit my success had motivated me to leave entirely. Austin was the first to speak, asking if this meant they wouldn't be getting the additional family support they'd been promised. His immediate concern was about his own financial situation rather than the impact on our parents or our family relationships. He seemed genuinely confused about why I wouldn't just pay more rent to help his family as expected. My parents looked stricken as they began calculating the financial implications of my departure. They'd been counting on my rent payments to help cover their mortgage while supporting Austin's family and hadn't prepared for the possibility that their demands might drive me away entirely. They were facing an immediate budget crisis that would force them to make difficult choices about Austin's support. When my mother asked if we could negotiate a compromise, I explained that their approach to the rent increase had revealed fundamental differences in how we viewed family relationships and financial responsibilities. I said that their willingness to threaten eviction over money showed that they viewed our relationship as primarily transactional rather than emotional. My father tried to argue that I was overreacting to what he called a reasonable request for increased contribution to family expenses. I reminded him that they'd presented the rent increase as an ultimatum rather than a request, and had threatened to evict me if I didn't comply. I pointed out that ultimatums sometimes don't work out the way people expect. The conversation became increasingly desperate as my parents realized the scope of their miscalculation. They'd assumed that I needed their affordable housing more than they needed my financial contributions, but the opposite was actually true. Their attempt to leverage my housing situation had motivated me to eliminate their leverage entirely by finding better alternatives. Austin's wife finally spoke up, asking if there was anything they could do to convince me to stay and continue helping support their family. I told her that the issue wasn't about money but about respect, and that their assumption that I should subsidize their lifestyle because I was single showed a fundamental lack of understanding about fairness and personal responsibility. When Austin accused me of abandoning family when they needed help most, I reminded him that he'd created his own financial problems through poor decisions about education, career, and family planning. I said that expecting other people to solve problems you've created for yourself isn't family support, it's exploitation. My parents made several desperate offers, including reducing the proposed rent increase or eliminating it entirely if I'd agree to stay. But I explained that their willingness to exploit my success had changed my perspective on our relationship permanently. I said that moving out was about more than money. It was about establishing healthy boundaries and refusing to enable destructive family dynamics. The meeting ended with my parents looking devastated as they realized that their attempt to secure additional funding for Austin's family had cost them my rent payments entirely. They were facing the immediate prospect of covering Austin's expenses without my financial contribution, while also losing the rental income they'd been counting on. 2 weeks later, I moved into my new apartment and immediately loved the independence and space that came with living completely on my own. My parents were forced to reduce their support for Austin's family significantly, and he had to take on additional work to cover expenses they could no longer afford to subsidize. The family relationships were permanently changed by the incident, but in some ways the new dynamic was healthier. My parents could no longer take my financial contributions for granted, and Austin was forced to develop more realistic expectations about family support. I maintained contact with everyone but established clear boundaries about financial discussions and requests for help. 6 months later, Austin was working full-time for the first time in years and had started making more responsible decisions about spending and budgeting. My parents had adjusted their retirement plans to account for their reduced income, but were no longer draining their savings to enable Austin's irresponsibility. The crisis my departure created had forced everyone to face financial reality. Looking back, I'm grateful that my parents' attempted exploitation motivated me to finally move out and establish complete independence. Their assumption that being single made me a convenient source of funding for Austin's family revealed their true priorities and helped me understand that some family relationships require firm boundaries to remain healthy. The experience taught me that people will often take advantage of your success if you let them, and that family status doesn't exempt anyone from basic principles of fairness and respect. My parents learned that threatening people sometimes motivates them to eliminate your leverage entirely, and that exploitation disguised as family obligation can destroy the relationships you're trying to preserve.